The waves crashed violently onto the sand, leaving behind fragments of wood, ropes, and small objects dragged in by the storm. Marco opened his eyes, his head pounding and his mouth dry. He was lying on the shore, his body stiff from the cold and exhaustion. It took him a few minutes to realize what had happened, the shipwreck. The last thing he remembered was the chaos on the cruise ship, the wind howling, and the sensation of being swallowed by the waves. Looking around, he realized he was alone. There was no sign of other survivors, only the endless sea and a lush island rising behind him. With trembling legs, he stood up and began walking along the beach, calling out in hopes that someone might hear him. After hours of walking without success, Marco heard a sound coming from the trees. He froze, his heart racing. "Is someone there?" he shouted. From the dense vegetation, a figure emerged. It was a woman, wearing a long, dark, tattered dress and a veil over her hair. "Yes," she answered in a calm but slightly hoarse voice. "I'm here." Marco stared at her in disbelief. "Who are you?" "Sister Chiara," the woman said, stepping toward him with confident strides. "And you?" "Marco," he replied, still confused. "How did you get here?" "I was on a smaller boat, part of a missionary expedition," Sister Chiara explained. "The storm hit us. I don't know what happened to my companions." The two exchanged only a few words, both too exhausted and hungry to talk much. Together, they began exploring the island in search of food and water. They found a small clearing with a clear stream, where they could drink and gather some edible berries. Survival instincts drove them to work side by side, building a makeshift shelter out of branches and leaves. Their first night on the island was quiet but tense. Marco couldn't help but watch Sister Chiara, fascinated by her calm demeanor and ability to adapt to the situation. She, on the other hand, avoided looking at him as much as possible, focusing solely on what needed to be done to survive. In the following days, they began to learn more about each other. Marco shared his life story, a dull office job, shallow relationships, and a vacation that was supposed to be an escape from routine. "I never imagined I'd end up here," he said with a bitter laugh. Sister Chiara, however, spoke little about herself. She mentioned only that, before taking her vows, she had lived a normal life but had felt a calling too strong to ignore. Marco, curious, tried to dig deeper. "Don't you miss your old life?" he asked. "Sometimes," Sister Chiara admitted, gazing at the sea. "But I found a peace I could never have imagined anywhere else." Marco couldn't help but notice how beautiful she was, despite their harsh circumstances. Her simplicity and the serenity she exuded struck him more than he wanted to admit. He began teasing her, trying to provoke a reaction. "I bet you broke someone's heart when you decided to become a nun," he said one day, a mischievous smile on his face. Sister Chiara looked at him calmly. "I've never regretted my choice," she replied. "And I'm not here to discuss the past." Marco laughed, but there was a hint of respect in his tone. "You're stronger than you seem." The days passed slowly, and survival became their only priority. They found a more stable food source by fishing with makeshift tools and gathered wood to keep a fire burning at night. But as time went on, the tension between them grew. Marco kept testing Sister Chiara's boundaries, driven by a mix of curiosity and attraction, while she tried to remain composed, even when his comments became more personal. One evening, as they sat around the fire, Marco decided to be more direct. "You know, Chiara," he said, deliberately dropping the religious title, "I can't help but think that if things were different, we could be friends, or maybe something more." Sister Chiara looked at him with a mix of surprise and sternness. "Marco," she said firmly, "we're not here to fantasize about what could be. We're here to survive, nothing more." Despite her decisive tone, Marco noticed a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. He didn't push further, but he knew he had touched on something deep. That night, they both stayed awake longer than usual, each lost in their own thoughts. On the island, the line between past and present seemed to blur. For Sister Chiara, memories of a distant life began to resurface. For Marco, his attraction to her grew stronger with each passing day. Both of them sensed that something was changing, but neither was ready to confront it openly. As their days on the island dragged on, the dynamic between Marco and Sister Chiara continued to shift. The close collaboration required for survival had brought them closer. Despite their differences and moments of tension, there was a growing intimacy in their interactions. Conversations that had initially been superficial became more personal. One afternoon, as they worked together to build a makeshift trap for small animals, Marco observed Chiara closely. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "I've never met anyone like you. You're calm, determined, and yet, you seem to carry a heavy burden." Chiara paused for a moment, avoiding his gaze. "I don't carry a burden," she replied, her voice steady. "I carry faith, and that gives me strength." Marco smiled, but his tone grew more serious. "It's not always easy to believe, is it? I mean, if there's a God, why would he put us here? Why would he let us end up in this situation?" Chiara looked at him, her eyes calm and deep. "I don't know why we're here, Marco. But I believe that every trial has a purpose. Even this one." The conversation stayed with Marco for the rest of the day. He wasn't a religious man, but something about the way Chiara spoke of faith made him reflect. That evening, as they sat around the fire, he decided to open up. "Before the shipwreck," he began, "my life didn't have much meaning. I worked just to pay the bills, spent time with people I didn't really care about. This vacation was supposed to be a way to escape, but I didn't even know what I was running from." Chiara listened silently, letting him speak. Marco lowered his gaze to the fire. "And now, here, with nothing, it feels like I can see everything more clearly. The things I thought mattered don't anymore. And you're like a light in all this darkness." Chiara stiffened slightly, sensing where the conversation was heading. "Marco," she said gently, "I understand how you feel, but we mustn't confuse our emotions with the situation we're in. Loneliness and fear can make us see things differently." Marco shook his head, his tone growing more passionate. "It's not just loneliness, Chiara. It's the way you make me feel. You make me believe I could be a better person, that I could find meaning in my life." Chiara remained silent, her heart torn between compassion and her devotion to her calling. That night, she prayed for a long time, asking God for strength and clarity. She knew Marco was searching for something greater, but she also felt that her vocation needed to remain her focus. The turning point came a few days later, during one of their explorations along the coast. They discovered a floating crate washed ashore. Inside were some supplies, a survival kit, and most importantly, an emergency radio. Chiara saw the discovery as a divine sign. "God has heard us," she said with a smile of gratitude. Marco, however, seemed less enthusiastic. "What if no one answers?" he asked, staring at the radio. "What if we're still stuck here, holding on to a hope that fades away?" Chiara placed a hand on his arm. "Hope doesn't fade, Marco. It's what keeps us alive." They used the radio to send out a distress signal, but there was no immediate response. In the following days, the waiting brought an air of introspection. Marco, increasingly aware of his feelings, decided it was time to address Chiara openly. "Chiara," he said one evening, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I need to tell you something." One evening, as the fire crackled between them, Marco turned to her. "Chiara, I have to tell you. I've fallen in love with you. I can't pretend it hasn't happened." Chiara remained silent for a long moment. Then, with a firm but gentle voice, she replied, "Marco, what you feel is real, but we can't let it change who we are. I've made a choice, and that choice defines me. I can't go back on it." Marco lowered his gaze, hurt but also respectful of her honesty. "What if it's fate? What if we're here to find something together?" Chiara met his eyes, her gaze filled with compassion. Our meeting wasn't random, but it's not for the reason you think. Maybe we're here to help each other see more clearly who we are and what we truly want. The next day, the radio finally emitted a signal. A rescue ship had received their message and was on its way. Marco and Chiara prepared to leave the island, each with mixed emotions. For Marco, the island had been a chance for rediscovery, but leaving it meant facing a reality that felt more confusing than ever. For Chiara, it had been a test of her faith, an opportunity to reaffirm her commitment. On the day the rescue ship arrived, the island seemed wrapped in an unreal calm. Marco and Sister Chiara stood on the shore, watching the vessel approach slowly. The sound of the waves was the only thing breaking the silence filled with emotions. For days, they had shared every moment, every challenge, every reflection. Now, the thought of parting left them with a mix of relief and melancholy. "Well, here we are," Marco said, trying to mask his hesitation with a forced smile. "We're saved." Chiara nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "Salvation isn't just leaving the island, Marco," she said calmly. "It's also finding peace within ourselves." As the rescuers helped them board the ship, Marco couldn't help but glance back at the island they had left behind. It had been a place of trials, discovery, and growth. Despite everything, he felt changed, but still uncertain about what it all meant for his future. On board the ship, the two were temporarily separated for medical checks and identification procedures. Marco, sitting in a small cabin, found himself staring at the floor, lost in thought. Chiara's words echoed in his mind. "Maybe we're here to help each other see more clearly who we are." When they were reunited on the deck, Marco approached Chiara, his expression serious but determined. "Chiara," he said, his tone calmer than usual, "I don't know how to explain it, but this experience, you, have changed me. I don't know what I'll do when I get home, but I know I don't want to go back to the life I had before." Chiara looked at him, her eyes full of understanding. "It's not important to know right away what to do, Marco. What matters is starting to walk in a new direction. And remembering that you're never alone on that path." Marco nodded, feeling a weight lift from his chest. It wasn't a promise of a clear future, but it was a beginning. After they were dropped off at the port and welcomed by the authorities, the two parted ways. Marco realized that the bond they had shared on the island couldn't be replicated in the real world. But it wasn't a bitter goodbye, it was one filled with respect and gratitude. The following weeks were intense for Marco. Back home, he made an important decision, to leave his monotonous job and dedicate himself to something with deeper meaning. Through research and connections, he found a charity organization that provided support to people in need, including survivors of natural disasters. Working in that environment made Marco reflect even more on the importance of human connections and the value of kindness. Every time he helped someone, he thought of Chiara and how she had inspired him to find the best in himself. Meanwhile, Sister Chiara returned to her convent. The experience on the island had given her new strength in her vocation. In her prayers, she often found herself thinking of Marco, not as a temptation, but as an example of how human love could be transformed into something greater and spiritual. When she spoke with the other sisters, she described the island as a place of trials but also of rebirth. "God places the right people next to us, even in the hardest moments," she would say. "It's not always to change them but to help them find the path that already exists within them." A year later, Marco received a letter. It was simple, unsigned, but the message was unmistakable. "Never stop seeking your path, Marco. Hope never fades if you keep believing in it." Marco smiled, knowing exactly who the sender was. That letter was a quiet reminder of what they had shared, a token of how faith and human connection could overcome any barrier. Now fully committed to helping others, Marco found a new peace. He was no longer the dissatisfied man who had boarded that cruise ship. His life had gained meaning, and he knew it all began on that island. Chiara, in the silence of the convent, continued her spiritual journey with renewed awareness. Marco had been a test but also a blessing, a living reminder of how love and faith could coexist and transform into something greater. Their paths had diverged, but the bond they had built remained, like an invisible thread stretching across time and space. The most challenging experiences can become opportunities to discover our true purpose. Even the most unlikely connections can teach us lessons about faith, love, and resilience, helping us grow and find our way. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss the next videos. Let us know in the comments, would you have done the same in their place? Would you have had this courage? Share the video with your friends. See you next time.